The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Private Daniel Morrison stood at his post, sweat trickling down his back beneath his heavy ceremonial uniform. At 24 years old, Morrison had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 18 months, long enough to have seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold on this particularly busy Saturday afternoon. Morrison came from a military family steeped in tradition. His father had served in the Falklands War, his grandfather in Northern Ireland, and his great-grandfather had fought in World War II. The red tunic he wore carried the weight of generations of service, and Morrison took his duty seriously. He had trained for months to achieve the perfect stillness, the unwavering focus, and the mental discipline required to stand motionless for hours while maintaining complete awareness of his surroundings. The training had been brutal. Hours of standing perfectly still while instructors shouted, threw objects, and created every possible distraction. Morrison had learned to control his breathing, to ignore pain, hunger, and discomfort. He had mastered the art of peripheral vision, able to track movement and assess threats without moving his eyes. Most importantly, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. On this particular afternoon, the palace was packed with tourists from around the world. The summer season always brought larger crowds, and today was no exception. Families posed for photos, tour guides shared historical facts, and the usual mix of respectful visitors and curious onlookers filled the courtyard. Morrison had been at his post for nearly 2 hours, his body perfectly still despite the increasing heat and the growing crowd. Among the tourists was a group of 5 young men in their early 20s, clearly American based on their loud voices and casual attire. They wore expensive designer clothes, carried the latest smartphones, and moved with the confident swagger of people who had never been told no in their lives. These were the sons of wealthy families, spending their gap year traveling Europe on their parents' credit cards, treating the world as their personal playground. The leader of the group was Brad Hutchinson, a 22-year-old from Beverly Hills whose father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. Brad was tall, blonde, and had never worked a day in his life. He was accompanied by his best friends, Tyler, whose family owned several tech companies, Marcus, the son of a prominent Hollywood agent, Jake, whose father was a successful surgeon, and Connor, whose family had made their fortune in real estate. These young men had spent the last 3 weeks posting content on social media from their European tour, collecting likes and followers by documenting their adventures across London, Paris, and Rome. They had already posted videos of themselves being loud and obnoxious at famous landmarks, always pushing boundaries to create more engaging content for their online audiences. When they first spotted Morrison at his post, Brad's eyes lit up with opportunity. He had heard about the famous royal guards and their legendary discipline, but seeing one in person sparked an idea that would prove to be a massive miscalculation. To Brad, Morrison wasn't a dedicated soldier performing an important duty. He was simply another prop for their social media content. "Guys, check this out," Brad whispered to his friends, pulling out his phone and switching to video mode. "I've heard these dudes literally can't move no matter what you do to them. This is going to be epic content." The group gathered around Brad as he began filming, positioning themselves just outside the restricted area but close enough to Morrison to be clearly visible in the frame. Morrison, though maintaining his stoic expression, was immediately aware of their presence and their intent. His training had taught him to recognize different types of threats and situations, and he could sense that these tourists were going to be problematic. What Morrison didn't know was that Brad had over 1 million followers on various social media platforms, and his videos regularly received hundreds of thousands of views. Brad had built his online presence by creating increasingly outrageous content, always pushing boundaries and generating controversy to drive engagement. His previous viral videos included pranking hotel staff, being deliberately rude to service workers, and creating public disturbances in famous locations. The other members of the group were equally invested in their online personas. They had spent their entire adult lives seeking validation through social media metrics, measuring their self-worth in likes, comments, and shares. The idea of creating content that could potentially go viral was irresistible to them. Regardless of the consequences or the impact on others, Morrison could hear them discussing their plan in hushed but excited tones. They were clearly American, probably wealthy based on their clothes and equipment, and definitely the type of tourists who viewed other people as entertainment rather than human beings deserving of respect. He had encountered similar groups before, but usually they limited themselves to taking photos and making jokes among themselves. The palace security team was also aware of the group's presence. Head of security David Chen had been monitoring them since they arrived, noting their behavior and the way they seemed to be planning something. Chen had 20 years of experience in security work and had developed an instinct for trouble. These 5 young men were setting off every alarm bell in his professional assessment. The crowd around Morrison's position was growing larger as other tourists noticed the group of Americans setting up what appeared to be some kind of performance or demonstration. Some visitors sensed that something entertaining was about to happen and began positioning themselves to get a better view. Others, more familiar with proper etiquette around the royal guards, began moving away from the area, uncomfortable with the obvious disrespect that was about to unfold. Morrison's fellow guards at nearby positions were also aware that something was developing, though they couldn't turn to look or communicate directly. They could sense the change in crowd dynamics and the building tension. The guards had their own informal communication system, subtle signals and awareness that allowed them to coordinate without breaking their positions. As Brad finished, setting up his phone to capture the perfect angle, he looked back at Morrison with a smirk that revealed his complete lack of understanding about what he was about to attempt. To Brad, this was just another opportunity to create content and gain attention. He had no comprehension of the discipline, training, and dedication that Morrison represented, no understanding of the military tradition and service that the uniform symbolized. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Morrison's training and discipline, but his character as a human being. Brad and his friends were about to learn that there are consequences to treating other people as objects for entertainment, and that some individuals possess a strength and dignity that cannot be broken by mockery or disrespect. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the palace courtyard. The crowd continued to grow, and the cameras were rolling as Brad Hutchinson prepared to make the biggest mistake of his privileged life. What happened next would indeed destroy him completely, but not in the way he expected when he first pressed record on his phone. Brad Hutchinson stepped closer to the barrier rope, his phone held high and his friends gathered behind him like a pack of hyenas ready to feast on chaos. The livestream was already active, with viewers flooding in as notifications spread across his social media accounts. Comments began pouring in from his followers, encouraging him to push boundaries and create the kind of controversial content that had made him internet famous. Alright guys, we're here at Buckingham Palace and we've got one of those famous guards who supposedly can't move no matter what, Brad announced to his camera, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. Let's see if that's actually true, or if it's just British propaganda. Private Morrison could hear every word clearly, but his expression remained unchanged. His training had prepared him for verbal taunts and attempts to provoke reactions. What Brad didn't understand was that Morrison had endured months of psychological conditioning designed to help guards maintain composure under far worse circumstances than anything a spoiled tourist could devise. Tyler pulled out his own phone to capture different angles while Marcus began encouraging Brad with increasingly crude suggestions. Jake and Connor positioned themselves to block any security personnel who might try to intervene, though they tried to make their obstruction look casual and unintentional. "Hey, soldier boy," Brad called out loudly, ensuring his voice would carry across the courtyard and attract maximum attention. "Can you hear me in there, or are you just a really good statue?" The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists looked uncomfortable and began moving away from the area, clearly disapproving of the Americans' behavior. Others, unfortunately, seemed entertained by the spectacle and moved closer, pulling out their own phones to record what they sensed would be an interesting confrontation. A family from Germany watched in disgust as the young men continued their taunts. The father, Klaus Müller, had served in the German military and understood the discipline and dedication required to maintain such a position. He began herding his own family away from the area, not wanting his children to witness what was clearly going to escalate into something inappropriate. An elderly British couple, Harold and Margaret Pemberton, who had been visiting the palace weekly for over 40 years, stood nearby, shaking their heads in dismay. Harold was a World War II veteran who had deep respect for military service and tradition. "Disgraceful," he muttered to his wife. "Absolutely disgraceful behavior." But Brad was just getting started. The live viewer count on his stream was climbing rapidly, and the comments were becoming more encouraging and more extreme. His followers were egging him on, suggesting increasingly outrageous actions that would generate more engagement and potentially create a viral moment. "I bet this guy makes minimum wage to stand here like a dummy," Brad continued, moving even closer to the barrier. "Probably couldn't get a real job, so he's playing dress up for tourists. What do you think, guys?" His friends laughed and made crude comments about Morrison's intelligence, his appearance, and his career choice. They began taking turns making jokes and insults, treating Morrison like he was an inanimate object rather than a human being performing an important duty. Morrison's peripheral vision allowed him to track every movement, every gesture, and every expression. He could see the growing crowd, could sense the increasing tension, and could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. But more than that, he could sense the test that was unfolding. This wasn't just about maintaining his position anymore. This was about representing something larger than himself. Security officer Chen was monitoring the situation closely through both direct observation and the palace's extensive camera system. He had called for additional backup and was coordinating with his team to ensure they could respond quickly if the situation escalated beyond verbal harassment. But Chen also knew that intervening too early might escalate the situation unnecessarily and could interfere with Morrison's ability to handle the challenge. According to military protocol, the palace had specific procedures for dealing with disruptive tourists. But this situation was more complex, because the Americans weren't technically breaking any laws yet. They were staying outside the restricted areas. And while their behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful, it hadn't yet crossed the line into criminal activity. Brad's confidence grew with each passing minute that Morrison failed to react. In his narcissistic worldview, Morrison's discipline was actually weakness. His self-control was evidence of stupidity, and his dedication to duty was nothing more than a lack of options. Brad had never encountered anyone with genuine strength of character, surrounded as he was by people who either enabled his behavior or were paid to tolerate it. "You know what I think?" Brad announced to his growing online audience. "I think these guys are all fake. I think they hire actors to stand here and pretend to be soldiers because real soldiers would never put up with this kind of treatment." Tyler stepped forward with his own inflammatory comments. "Yeah, and look at that uniform. It's probably just a costume from some theater company. Real military guys would have kicked our asses by now." What they didn't understand was that real military discipline was exactly the opposite of what they expected. Morrison's ability to remain calm and controlled in the face of their provocation was evidence of genuine strength, not weakness. His training had taught him that responding to every provocation with violence or anger was the behavior of undisciplined individuals, not professional soldiers. Marcus began making exaggerated gestures and faces, trying to get Morrison to break character. He jumped up and down, waved his arms, and made ridiculous noises, all while staying just outside the restricted area. His behavior attracted even more attention from passersby, many of whom stopped to stare at the bizarre spectacle. The livestream audience was growing rapidly as viewers shared the content across various platforms. But the comments section was beginning to show a split in public opinion. While some viewers were encouraging the harassment, others were expressing disgust at the Americans' behavior and admiration for the guards. Composure. Jake decided to escalate things further by beginning to chant insults, trying to get the crowd to join in. "Hey everybody, let's see if we can wake up Sleeping Beauty over here. Come on, make some noise." Fortunately, most of the tourists ignored his attempts to involve them in the harassment. The majority of visitors to Buckingham Palace came to show respect for British history and tradition, not to participate in juvenile pranks. But Jake's shouting did succeed in attracting even more attention to the situation. Morrison could feel his heart rate beginning to increase slightly, not from fear or anger, but from the growing adrenaline that comes with being the center of such intense focus. His training kicked in automatically, and he began using breathing techniques to maintain his calm center. He thought about his grandfather, who had faced far worse challenges during actual combat, and drew strength from that family legacy of service. Connor pulled out a speaker and began playing loud music, hoping the noise would force Morrison to react. The music was deliberately chosen to be obnoxious and disruptive. Heavy bass, explicit lyrics, and maximum volume. Other tourists began complaining about the noise, and several families with young children moved away from the area entirely. Security Officer Chen decided this had gone far enough. The loud music was disrupting other visitors and creating a public nuisance. He began moving toward the group, but he also knew that any intervention now would need to be handled very carefully. These young men were clearly documenting everything, and any perceived overreach by security could become its own viral controversy. As Chen approached, Brad noticed the security presence and realized his time might be limited. He decided to make one final, desperate attempt to provoke a reaction from Morrison, not realizing that his next action would trigger consequences he never could have imagined. With Security Officer Chen approaching and his live stream audience reaching peak numbers, Brad knew he had to do something dramatic to cement his viral moment. The adrenaline of performing for thousands of online viewers had clouded his judgment completely, and the encouraging comments from his followers had convinced him that he was entertaining the world rather than embarrassing himself. "Watch this, guys," Brad whispered to his friends before turning back to his phone camera. Time to take this to the next level. What Brad did next would haunt him for years to come. He pulled out a 20-pound note from his wallet, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it directly at Private Morrison's face. The paper ball bounced off Morrison's cheek, but the guard's expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. This only infuriated Brad further. "Did you see that?" Brad shouted into his phone. "This guy is so pathetic he won't even react when someone throws money at his face. What kind of man just stands there and takes that kind of disrespect?" The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. The German family that had been moving away stopped in their tracks, with the father Klaus actually taking a step back toward the confrontation, his military instincts telling him that a line had just been crossed. The elderly British couple looked genuinely shocked, while other tourists began pulling out their phones not to support Brad, but to document what they recognized as completely unacceptable behavior. Morrison felt the paper ball hit his face, but more than the physical contact, he felt the weight of the insult it represented. In his 18 months of service, he had never been deliberately struck by anything thrown by a tourist. Rain, wind, and the occasional accidental bump were part of the job, but this was different. This was a deliberate assault on his dignity and the uniform he represented. But Morrison's training held firm. His great-grandfather had stood firm under German artillery fire during World War II. His grandfather had maintained discipline while under sniper fire in Northern Ireland. His father had kept his composure during riots and civil unrest. Morrison would not be the first in his family line to break under pressure, especially not pressure from a spoiled child throwing paper balls. Tyler, emboldened by Brad's escalation, decided to join in. He pulled out a handful of coins and began flicking them at Morrison's uniform, aiming for the shiny buttons and ceremonial decorations. Each coin made a small metallic ping as it bounced off the red fabric, but Morrison remained as still as granite. "Come on, robot man," Tyler shouted. "Show us you're human. Do something." Marcus began throwing small pieces of trash he found on the ground, candy wrappers, bottle caps, even small pebbles. Each projectile was carefully aimed at Morrison's face and uniform, a calculated campaign of humiliation designed to break his composure and create the viral moment they were desperate for. The livestream comments were becoming increasingly polarized. While some viewers continued to encourage the harassment, others were expressing disgust and reporting the stream to platform moderators. Several viewers had already identified the location and were contacting British authorities directly. The internet was beginning to mobilize against Brad and his friends. Though they were too focused on their immediate performance to notice the shift in public sentiment, Security Officer Chen was now close enough to intervene, but he hesitated for a crucial moment. His experience told him that sometimes the best response to bullies was to let them expose themselves completely before taking action. Chen could see that Morrison was handling the situation with incredible professionalism, and he also noticed that the crowd was turning against the Americans. A group of British teenagers who had been watching from nearby finally had enough. Led by a 17-year-old named Jamie Richardson, whose older brother served in the army, they began shouting at the Americans to stop their harassment. "Oh, leave him alone, you absolute muppets," Jamie called out, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "He's doing his job, you disrespectful idiots." His friends joined in, creating a counter-narrative to Brad's performance. "You're embarrassing yourselves," one of them shouted, "and you're embarrassing your country." But Brad was too deep into his performance to back down now. The confrontation with the British teenagers only added to the drama he was trying to create, and he began directing insults at them as well, while continuing to harass Morrison. Jake decided to try a different approach. He began making crude gestures and inappropriate comments about Morrison's personal life, his family, and his intelligence. The language became increasingly offensive and personal, designed to cut through professional training and provoke an emotional response. "I bet your parents are real proud of their son playing dress-up for tourists," Jake sneered. "What a waste of space. Couldn't make it in the real military. So you're out here playing pretend soldier for pocket change." These words hit differently than the physical harassment. Morrison could ignore paper balls and coins, but attacks on his family's military legacy struck at the core of his identity. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first sign of emotion he had shown. During the entire ordeal, Connor noticed the slight change in Morrison's expression and immediately alerted the others. "Hey, I think we're getting to him. Keep going." The encouragement from his friend pushed Jake to become even more vicious in his verbal assault. He began making specific comments about Morrison's appearance, his intelligence, and his worth as a human being. The language became so offensive that even some of their online supporters began turning against them in the comments. An American tourist named Patricia Williams, who was visiting London with her own family, felt compelled to intervene. As a military spouse whose husband was deployed overseas, she understood the sacrifice and dedication that military service required. She approached the group of harassers with fire in her eyes. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," she said loudly, her voice carrying clearly in the relatively quiet courtyard. "This young man is serving his country with honor, and you're treating him like garbage. You're a disgrace to America." Her intervention sparked applause from nearby tourists, but it also drew Brad's attention. Never one to back down from confrontation, especially when it might generate more content. Brad turned his camera toward Patricia and began hurling insults at her as well. "Oh great, another social justice warrior," Brad announced to his stream. "Lady, mind your own business. We're just having some fun with a guy who gets paid to stand still." Patricia's husband might have been thousands of miles away, but her protective instincts were fully engaged. "Fun? You call throwing things at someone and insulting them fun? You're bullying someone who can't defend himself because of his professional obligations? That's not fun. That's cowardice." The confrontation was now involving multiple parties, with Brad and his friends facing opposition from British teenagers, an American military wife, and a growing number of tourists who were disgusted by their behavior. But instead of recognizing that they had crossed every line of decency, the 5 young men doubled down on their harassment. Marcus pulled out a water bottle and began squirting water at Morrison's uniform, trying to create visible stains on the pristine red fabric. The water created dark spots on the ceremonial tunic, each one a deliberate mark of disrespect that would normally require hours of cleaning and maintenance to remove. Morrison felt the cool water soaking through his uniform and touching his skin, but he also felt something else, a growing sense of anticipation. His training had taught him to recognize patterns in crowd behavior, and he could sense that the situation was approaching a turning point. The harassment had reached such an extreme level that consequences were inevitable. What Morrison didn't know was that those consequences would come not from security intervention or crowd pressure, but from a source that none of them, including Morrison himself, could have predicted. Just as the situation seemed to reach its peak intensity, a new figure appeared that would change everything. Colonel James Whitmore, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard Regiment, had been alerted to the disturbance by palace security and had come personally to assess the situation. At 58 years old, Whitmore was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and had commanded respect in every theater where he had served. Colonel Whitmore was not a man to be taken lightly. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with steel-gray hair and bearing the scars of actual combat, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a room simply by entering it. His dress uniform displayed ribbons and medals earned through decades of distinguished service, including a Distinguished Service Order for Valor under fire in Afghanistan. As Whitmore approached the scene, his experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation. He could see his guard maintaining perfect discipline despite clear evidence of harassment, water stains on the uniform, debris scattered around the post, and the obvious agitation of the crowd. More importantly, he could see 5 young men who had no idea they were about to face consequences beyond their worst nightmares. Brad was in the middle of another insulting tirade, directing crude comments at Morrison while his friends continued their campaign of harassment. The livestream had reached over 50,000 concurrent viewers, with comments flooding in faster than anyone could read them. In his narcissistic focus on his performance, Brad completely failed to notice the imposing figure approaching from behind. "I wonder if this statue can even speak English," Brad was saying to his camera, his voice dripping with contempt. Maybe he's just some foreign guy they hired to play dress up because he was too stupid to get a real job. That was the moment Colonel Whitmore decided he had heard enough. "Gentlemen," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military leadership. The single word cut through all other noise in the courtyard like a blade, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn throughout the area. Brad spun around and found himself face to face with a figure that seemed to embody everything he had been mocking. Whitmore's presence was so commanding that Brad actually took an involuntary step backward, his phone momentarily forgotten in his hand. "I am Colonel James Whitmore, commanding officer of this regiment," Whitmore continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone that suggested terrible consequences for those who had earned his displeasure. "I believe you gentlemen have been entertaining yourselves at the expense of one of my soldiers." The 5 Americans suddenly found themselves in a very different situation than they had anticipated. This wasn't a silent guard they could harass without consequence. This was a senior military officer who clearly had both the authority and the willingness to take action. Tyler, who had been so bold in throwing coins at Morrison, now seemed to shrink into himself under Whitmore's gaze. Marcus stopped his water bottle antics immediately, suddenly aware that his behavior might have legal consequences. Jake and Connor, who had been making crude jokes moments before, now stood silent and increasingly uncomfortable. But Brad, his judgment clouded by adrenaline and the attention from his online audience, made the catastrophic decision to continue his confrontation rather than backing down gracefully. "Oh great, another costume guy," Brad said to his camera, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "Let me guess, you're going to tell us we need to respect your little dress-up game here?" The crowd collectively gasped at Brad's response. Even tourists from other countries who weren't familiar with British military tradition could recognize that Brad had just made a serious mistake. Several people began moving away from the immediate area, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Colonel Whitmore's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle signs that indicated he was now personally invested in teaching these young men a lesson they would never forget. His voice remained calm, but each word was delivered with precision that suggested careful control over much stronger emotions. "I see," Whitmore said slowly. "And what country are you gentlemen from?" "We're Americans," Brad replied, puffing out his chest with misplaced pride. "And in America, we don't worship people who play soldier for tourists." This response revealed the depth of Brad's ignorance and cultural insensitivity. Not only was he insulting the British military tradition, but he was doing so while representing his own country as a tourist. Every American in the crowd felt second-hand embarrassment at being associated with these 5 individuals. Patricia Williams, the military wife who had spoken up earlier, closed her eyes in mortification. Her husband was deployed overseas, serving the same values and traditions that Morrison represented, and these idiots were making all Americans look bad with their behavior. Colonel Whitmore nodded thoughtfully, as if processing this information. "Americans, I see. And do you gentlemen have any military experience yourselves?" The question was delivered with the same calm tone, but it carried implications that were becoming clear to everyone except Brad and his friends. Whitmore was systematically building a case, gathering information that would be used in the complete dismantling of their arrogant facade. Military experience. Brad laughed, though the sound was becoming more forced. Why would we waste our time with that? We've got better things to do than play soldier. Tyler nodded in agreement. Yeah, we're entrepreneurs. We're building social media empires while these guys are playing dress up. What they didn't understand was that every word they spoke was digging their hole deeper. Colonel Whitmore had served alongside American forces in multiple theaters, had deep respect for the U.S. military, and understood the difference between Americans who served their country with honor and spoiled children who had never faced any real challenges in their lives. Entrepreneurs, Whitmore repeated, his tone suggesting he found the term amusing when applied to these individuals. And what exactly is the nature of your business enterprise? Brad, still failing to recognize the trap being set, eagerly explained their social media activities, their follower counts, and their monetization strategies. He seemed to believe that his online success would somehow impress the colonel or justify their behavior. What Brad didn't realize was that Whitmore was recording everything on his own device, documenting not just their harassment of Morrison, but their attitudes, their justifications, and their complete lack of remorse. The colonel had extensive experience in building cases for disciplinary action, and he was applying those same skills to this situation. Security Officer Chen had positioned himself strategically nearby, ready to intervene if the situation escalated to physical confrontation, but also, understanding that Colonel Whitmore was handling the situation with military precision. Chen had worked with Whitmore before and knew that the colonel's calm demeanor often preceded devastating consequences for those who had crossed him. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the palace grounds that something significant was happening. Many tourists had their phones out, but unlike Brad's supporters, they were documenting what they recognized as justice being served rather than celebrating harassment. Morrison remained at perfect attention throughout this exchange, but his peripheral vision allowed him to observe everything. He could see his commanding officer taking control of the situation with the same strategic thinking that had made him successful in combat operations. More importantly, he could sense that these 5 Americans were about to learn lessons about respect, consequences, and the difference between real strength and entitled behavior. Colonel Whitmore was just getting started, and Brad's live stream audience was about to witness the complete destruction of 5 arrogant tourists who had badly underestimated the man they were now facing. Colonel Whitmore listened patiently as Brad finished explaining his social media empire, nodding occasionally as if genuinely interested in the details. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even Brad's friends were beginning to shift uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading as they started to recognize the gravity of their situation. Fascinating, Whitmore said when Brad finished his explanation. So you make money by creating content that entertains people online, and today, you decided that harassing my soldier would make for good entertainment. Brad, still missing the warning signs, nodded eagerly. Exactly. Content creation is about pushing boundaries, getting reactions, making people talk. That's how you build an audience. I see, Whitmore replied, pulling out his own phone. Well then, you'll be pleased to know that I'm also creating content today. In fact, I've been recording our entire conversation. Brad's face went pale as the implications hit him. Recording? Wait, you can't do that without permission. Whitmore's smile was cold and professional. Actually, as this is a public space, and you've been live streaming your harassment of my soldier for the past 20 minutes, I believe I'm well within my rights. But don't worry, I'm sure my content will be just as entertaining as yours. The livestream comments were exploding as viewers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The tide of public opinion had turned completely, with thousands of comments now supporting the colonel and condemning the Americans' behavior. Now then, Whitmore continued, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. Let's discuss the consequences of your actions. You've assaulted a member of Her Majesty's forces by throwing objects at him. You've created a public disturbance. You've shown deliberate disrespect to a military installation. And you've done all of this while representing your country as tourists. Tyler tried to interrupt. Look, we were just having fun. It's not that serious. Not that serious. Whitmore's voice cut through Tyler's words like ice. Young man, Private Morrison has been standing at his post for over 3 hours in full ceremonial uniform, maintaining discipline and representing centuries of military tradition. He's earned his position through months of rigorous training, and he serves his country with honor. What exactly have you done to earn the right to treat him like your personal entertainment? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time since the harassment began, Brad and his friends found themselves truly speechless. They had spent their entire lives surrounded by people who either enabled their behavior or were paid to tolerate it. None of them had ever been forced to justify their actions to someone who wouldn't be impressed by their wealth or online following. Marcus attempted to salvage the situation. We didn't mean any disrespect to the military. We support the troops. Whitmore's expression suggested he found this claim particularly amusing. You support the troops. How exactly does throwing money at a soldier's face demonstrate support? How does calling him stupid and worthless show respect for military service? The questions were rhetorical, but they cut deep. Several American tourists in the crowd were shaking their heads in disgust, clearly embarrassed by their countrymen's behavior. Patricia Williams, the military wife, was recording everything on her own phone, intending to share it with military family groups who would be appalled by the harassment. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, "You claim to be entrepreneurs and content creators. Let me share some business advice. Successful enterprises are built on providing value to others, not on humiliating people who cannot defend themselves due to their professional obligations." Jake tried a different approach. "Look, we'll delete the video. No harm done, right?" Whitmore's laugh was genuinely amused now. "Delete the video? My dear boy, your live stream has been watched by over 70,000 people. Screenshots and recordings have already been captured by thousands of viewers. The internet, as you well know, is forever." The reality was beginning to sink in for the 5 Americans. Their faces showed dawning horror as they realized that their behavior had been permanently documented, and was rapidly spreading across social media platforms worldwide. "But here's what's going to happen next," Whitmore continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone issuing orders that would be obeyed without question. "You're going to apologize to Private Morrison, not for your audience, not for the cameras, but because you owe him the respect you should have shown from the beginning." Brad's jaw tightened. "We're not apologizing to anyone. We haven't done anything wrong." This response triggered something in Colonel Whitmore that his soldiers would have recognized as a very dangerous development. His voice remained calm, but his posture shifted slightly, and those with military experience in the crowd could see that he was transitioning from patience to active intervention. "Haven't done anything wrong?" Whitmore repeated slowly. "Let me explain something to you about accountability. In the military, we understand that our actions have consequences not just for ourselves, but for everyone we serve with. When you disrespect my soldier, you disrespect my entire regiment, my service, and everything we represent." Security Officer Chen chose this moment to step forward. Having coordinated with palace administration and local police, "Gentlemen," he announced, "you're being asked to leave the premises immediately. Your behavior constitutes harassment and creating a public disturbance." But Colonel Whitmore wasn't finished. "Actually, Officer Chen, I believe these gentlemen would benefit from understanding exactly what they've accomplished here today before they leave." Whitmore turned back to Brad, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool afternoon air. "Your video currently has over 200,000 views and is trending on multiple platforms. Comments are running approximately 95% against you. Your names, faces, and social media accounts have been identified by internet users around the world." The colonel paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "Major news outlets are already picking up the story. I expect you'll be receiving calls from journalists within the hour. Your parents' contact information has likely already been discovered and shared online." Tyler's face went white. "Our parents?" "Oh yes," Whitmore confirmed. "The internet is remarkably efficient at tracking down the families of people who behave badly in public. I imagine your parents will be fielding calls from reporters asking for comments on their children's behavior toward military personnel." Connor finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Whitmore's expression showed no sympathy. "What you do is learn that actions have consequences. You wanted to create content that would make people talk. Congratulations, you've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. The entire world is now talking about 5 spoiled American tourists who thought it would be funny to abuse a soldier." The live stream was still running, capturing every moment of their humiliation. Comments were pouring in from viewers around the world, many of them military personnel and veterans expressing their disgust at the Americans' behavior. The hashtag respect the guard was already trending globally. "You see, gentlemen," Whitmore continued, "true strength isn't about mocking those who can't fight back. It's about maintaining dignity under pressure, serving something larger than yourself, and treating others with respect regardless of whether it benefits you personally. Private Morrison has demonstrated all of these qualities today. What have you demonstrated?" The question hung in the air unanswered because they all knew the truth. They had demonstrated cowardice, cruelty, and complete lack of character. And now the entire world could see exactly who they really were beneath their expensive clothes and entitled attitudes. The destruction Colonel Whitmore had promised was now complete, but the consequences were just beginning. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the aftermath was still reverberating through the lives of everyone involved. The video, which had been viewed over 20 million times across all platforms, had become a case study in how social media can both enable bad behavior and deliver swift justice for those who cross the line. Brad Hutchinson's life had been completely destroyed. Within hours of the livestream, his real name, address, and family information had been discovered by internet users. His father's car dealership business had been flooded with negative reviews and boycott threats from military supporters. The family had been forced to hire a public relations firm to manage the crisis, costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Brad's social media accounts, which had once been his source of income and identity, became monuments to his humiliation. Every post was flooded with comments referencing the Royal Guard incident. Brands that had previously sponsored his content immediately terminated their contracts. His follower count plummeted as companies and individuals distanced themselves from the controversy. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the financial consequences. Brad had built his entire self-worth around his online persona and social media success. When that foundation crumbled, he found himself facing a mental health crisis that his privileged upbringing had never prepared him to handle. His friends had abandoned him one by one, as their own reputations became tainted by association. Tyler's family's tech companies faced boycotts from military families and veterans organizations. Marcus found himself blacklisted in Hollywood, where his father's agent business suffered significant client losses. Jake's father, a respected surgeon, faced embarrassing questions from colleagues and hospital administrators. Connor's family real estate business lost several major contracts as clients refused to be associated with the family. The incident had followed them all back to their university, where they faced disciplinary action and social ostracism. Their fraternity had expelled them to protect its own reputation. Former friends crossed the street to avoid being seen with them. Dating became impossible, as potential partners would recognize them from the viral video. But the consequences extended beyond just the 5 young men. The incident had sparked a global conversation about respect for military service members and the responsibility that comes with social media influence. Military academies began using the video as a teaching tool about dignity under pressure and appropriate civilian-military relations. Private Daniel Morrison, meanwhile, had become an international symbol of professional discipline and quiet strength. He received thousands of letters of support from around the world, including personal notes from heads of state, military leaders, and celebrities who had been moved by his composure under pressure. Morrison had been promoted ahead of schedule and offered opportunities for specialized training that would advance his military career significantly. But more importantly to him, he had upheld the family tradition of service with honor. His grandfather, now in his 90s, had watched the video with tears of pride, saying it reminded him of the discipline he had learned during World War II. The incident had also led to changes in palace security procedures. While the guards maintained their traditional discipline, additional measures were put in place to prevent harassment from reaching the level that Morrison had endured. Tourist education programs were expanded to help visitors understand the significance of the ceremonial duties they were observing. Colonel James Whitmore had received commendations from his superiors for his handling of the situation. His calm, professional dismantling of the tourists' arrogance had been praised as a masterclass in leadership and discipline. The video of his intervention had been shown in military leadership courses as an example of how to confront inappropriate behavior while maintaining dignity and authority. The palace itself had seen an unexpected increase in visitors, many of whom came specifically because they had been moved by the story of Morrison's discipline and wanted to pay their respects to the royal guards. Tour guides reported that visitors were more respectful and engaged, with many asking thoughtful questions about military service and tradition. The incident had also strengthened relationships between American and British military communities. Thousands of American service members and veterans had reached out to express their embarrassment at their countrymen's behavior and their admiration for Morrison's professionalism. Joint training exercises between American and British forces included discussions about the incident as an example of how military values transcend national boundaries. Patricia Williams, the American military wife who had spoken up during the incident, had become something of a celebrity in military family circles. Her intervention had been praised as an example of how civilians could appropriately support service members who were unable to defend themselves. She had been invited to speak at military family events about the importance of standing up for what's right. The broader impact on social media culture was significant. Platform administrators had used the incident to justify stricter policies against harassment and bullying. Several influencers had publicly sworn off prank content that targeted individuals who couldn't consent to participation. The incident had become a cautionary tale about the responsibility that comes with online influence. A year later, Brad attempted to return to social media with an apology video, but it was widely seen as insincere and comments sections filled with references to the Royal Guard incident, and the video was ultimately deleted after receiving overwhelmingly negative responses. He eventually left social media entirely and enrolled in a community college. Trying to rebuild his life away from the spotlight that had once defined him, his former friends had similarly struggled to move past the incident. Tyler had transferred to a different university after facing constant harassment on campus. Marcus had given up his entertainment industry aspirations and was working at a family friend's small business in a different state. Jake had switched his major from pre-med after his father's medical practice suffered ongoing reputation damage. Connor had moved abroad, hoping distance would help him escape the infamy. Meanwhile, the video continued to circulate, shared by military families, educators, and anyone wanting to illustrate the difference between true strength and bullying behavior. It had been translated into dozens of languages and was used in character education programs around the world. Private Morrison, now Lance Corporal Morrison, had married his longtime girlfriend in a ceremony attended by military personnel from multiple countries who had been inspired by his example. Colonel Whitmore had given a speech at the reception about how Morrison's behavior under pressure exemplified the best qualities of military service. The palace courtyard where the incident occurred had become something of a pilgrimage site for people wanting to show respect for military service. A small plaque had been installed commemorating not the incident itself, but the centuries of dedicated service represented by the royal guards who had stood at that post. The story had become legend within military circles, told to new recruits as an example of how to maintain dignity under the most challenging circumstances. Morrison's name was added to regimental histories, not for a moment of violence or heroism in combat, but for 20 minutes of perfect discipline that had inspired millions of people around the world. The 5 young Americans had sought to create a viral moment that would bring them fame and attention. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but not in the way they had intended. Their names would forever be associated with arrogance, disrespect, and the swift justice that social media could deliver to those who crossed the line from entertainment into cruelty. The incident served as a permanent reminder that in the age of instant global communication, character is revealed not in private moments, but in how we treat others when we think no one important is watching. Because as Brad Hutchinson and his friends had learned too late, everyone is watching, and the internet never forgets.